Good evening, everyone. We welcome you to the third and final talk of the IPR speaker series, and the first talk to be a collaborative effort between the ISPP Policy Review and the Women in Public Policy Club. We have with us today Dr. Shilpa Phadke, professor at the School of Media and Cultural Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She's co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Why Loiter? Women and Risk on Mumbai Streets, which examines women's access to public space. She's co-director of the documentary Under the Open Sky, and she has published widely both academically and in popular media. Her areas of interest include cities and public spaces, middle-class sexuality, practices of consumption, feminist pedagogy, feminist mothering, young women's relationship with feminism, and online public spaces. Today, she'll be talking to us about women's right to loiter and its neglect in urban policy. We'll have the lecture for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to questions. I now hand over the floor to Ms. Shilpa. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Priyadarshini, Sagrika, and all of you for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. And the policy question is always a hard one. We began research looking at women's access to public space in 2003. And as we do our interviews, people would say, so what will happen with this research? And it's a question you dread as a researcher, right? Because you're not quite sure what if anything is going to happen, come out of your research. It's this kind of, you're going to write something of it and you hope that it will be carried forward. So we would sort of, hum and haw. But sometime as we were doing this research, one of the things we discovered via our interviews was that women were deeply invested in lighting, okay? That particularly at night, many times, and many women would say that either street lighting at railway stations, lighting at entries and exits, foot over bridges of railway stations, all of that made a huge impact to how comfortable they felt. And as we happened to mention this as we were interviewing one of the managers of Central Railway. We said, and he sort of asked us, so what have you found? And we said, one of the things we found that a lot of women on railway stations say that particularly the foot over bridges are really dimly lit and bulbs are missing. And so he said, well, if you tell me where there are bulbs missing and where we could add illumination, we'll do it. So our research assistants actually were very unhappy with us because we made them actually spend time actually counting bulbs and checking illumination at 35 railway stations on the Central Railway, Harbour and main line on the suburban railway network in Mumbai. What was really nice was we then gave this report, of what lighting, on which platform, on the foot over bridges, on entries and exits. And a couple of months later, after submitting our report, we went back to check. And in fact, the illumination had increased. The only thing he said he couldn't do was he couldn't add illumination to the exits because that was under the jurisdiction of the Bombay Municipal Corporation. So he said, if we start to light it, they will say, now it's your job. So we are not taking over their job. That's their job. So there's this kind of boundary marking of who belongs to what. But after that, when people would ask us, so what will happen? We would very gratefully and very in great relief say, we did this study and the railway station sort of lighting has improved at railway stations. But I go back to my point that policy is always a hard question. You do research and you hope that it'll make some change. We said we would write in popular media and we did. We wrote a great deal and we continue to write a great deal in popular media. But it's always this kind of, you hope it'll make a difference, but you're not always sure that it will. All right, let me backtrack to our project. So what were we doing? We were looking at, and I want to flag here, and this is perhaps something that you all have done before, that we were doing research in 2003, and now in hindsight, and now that they also the conversation on the gender spectrum has moved a lot since 2003 when we began our research. And so I just want to flag that I use the category women, and I want to, even as one understands that gender is not a binary, and I want to point you all to an essay called Gender in Counterpoint by a scholar called Wendy Brown. It's a 2005 essay. It's easily available online, where she points out to us that ideologically and philosophically, okay, the debate has moved hugely, and we no longer see gender as a binary. We no longer see the category woman as stable. We no longer, in a philosophical and conceptual way, think that we can actually address men and women as if they are watertight binary categories at two ends of the spectrum. However, she said, okay, she says that despite this, a group of people, and here, I mean, I'm not her, but I'm saying that those of us who are assigned gender female at birth and who are brought up as women, okay, and Brown argues that the group of people who are called women continue to be discriminated against as women. And so she points out that we are compelled to engage with the binary categories, men and women. Okay. So the disclaimer I want to make here is that it is in this context now that I use the category woman. Okay. I will also at various points talk about different genders and other marginal citizens, but the category that we used really was the category women. We looked at, we did quite a lot of interviews with women who often were sort of were not seen as adequately feminine. And I'll talk to you a bit about that as well in terms of all women's spaces. But for now, I just want to flag that this is the context in which I use the category women. When we began this project, it was designed to look at questions of safety. But very, very quickly, we moved to questions of access. And the question we were asking ourselves is that what would produce the greatest level of access for women to public space? Very often we would be asked, but why are you studying Bombay? Okay, the Bombay women have access to public space. And at one level, this was certainly true then, and it is continues to be true now. And the reasons why women have more access to public space in Mumbai than they do in other parts of the country is one, is the public transport system. Okay, in fact, it was much better in 2003 than it is today. But there is a viable, usable public transport system that women have been using, and that also has space demarcated for women. And I'll also come back, I'll circle back to that question of reservation of compartments for women and what that might mean in terms of policy discourses. But one reason was transport. The other was that Mumbai has, located in the state of Maharashtra, has a history of social reform where where larger numbers of women than elsewhere in the country were being educated and were employed. Three, and this again, like transport has implications for public policy, is that Mumbai, unlike Delhi or Chandigarh, was not a modernist planned city. So it was not zoned. So commercial and residential spaces merged into each other. So you'd often have shops and restaurants down and housing above. And so very few spaces emptied out completely at night, right? And one of the things that makes spaces more accessible is if there is a street lighting, as I pointed out, but also just people milling around, okay? In the way in which an American scholar by the name of Jane Jacobs, and again, this is a book that perhaps you all have already read, but Jane Jacobs wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Great American Cities, where she engaged with, among other things, questions of access. And one of the things she talks about, which is very widely cited, is this concept of eyes on the street. That if there are different groups of people watching the street, it makes the street safer and more comfortable and accessible for everybody. Even as we move to questions of access, and among the various things we found was street lighting, other people hanging around, shops that were open, and also hawkers. Hawkers made streets more accessible, and I will circle back to hawkers as well. Now, we also began to critique the discourse of safety. Now, the discourse of safety, we realized very, very quickly, was a deeply limited discourse. One, it was confined to a particular kind of woman. It was confined to a woman who could be seen as respectable, often middle class, upper caste, someone who, when she accessed public space, had a purpose in accessing public space. Cast against this middle class woman, okay, were two kinds of people. One was the lower class man, often the migrant, who was the potential perpetrator of violence in public space. The second person was the non-respectable woman, the sex worker, the bar dancer, anyone who was therefore then quote unquote not worthy of protection. So people were cast into different categories. The respectable middle class woman who was worthy of protection, okay, the who should then symbolize all of the virtues that were demanded of good Indian women, okay, the docile Bharatiya Nari, if you like. The second category were the perpetrators, okay, the potential perpetrators, whom the police would sort of eye suspiciously. And the third group was non-respectable women who were not worthy of protection. So we realized very quickly that this discourse was both a limited and a limiting one, and it was deeply conditional, that it only gave women a limited access to public space, and even that limited access was conditional. So we moved from a discourse of safety to one of risk. And we began to argue that what women needed in order to access public space was not conditional safety, but in fact the right to take risks. We realized from studying police data, okay, that not just that, in fact, when that many more, that the largest proportion of violence against women took place in the private space of the home and was perpetrated by people known to them. Okay. But the violence that was focused on in this context was public violence that was sort of perpetrated by strangers. Secondly, we also found that men, okay, were being beaten up a great deal. They were beating each other up. They were being beaten up. They were being attacked in public space. But nobody ever said that public space was unsafe for men, right? So we realized that violence was not the category that was in fact limiting women's access, because people seem perfectly perfectly accepting of violence against women in the home. It was only outside that they were very concerned about it. Okay, so it was not about violence. It was about mobility, control of mobility, and restrictions on women's sexuality. Now, we realized that families and communities were, of course, concerned that women should not be attacked by strangers against their will, but they were equally concerned that women should not form consenting relationship with unsuitable men. Okay, the wrong class, the wrong caste, and we see this now. And I will circle back to the UP Love Jihad ordinance when I come to the end of my lecture. Okay, but the desire to control who women would fall in love with, to control whom they could meet, particularly men, were also motivated families and communities to control women's access to public space. So we began to argue that what women needed in order to access public space was not this conditional safety, but in fact the right to take risks, which is not that I should never be attacked, because we pointed out no space was safe, women's homes were not safe. So if they were to be sexually assaulted in public space, medical legal processes should apply, and nobody should ask women why they were there, what they were wearing, whom they were with, which are the questions that get asked when women are sexually assaulted. We also pointed out, okay, and one of the things we were very, very careful about was to say that when we talked about the right to risk, we were talking about chosen risks, which is, if I want to go for a walk in a public park on a public promenade at midnight, I should be able to do so, right? But I should not be stuck in a city because there was lack of public transport. I should not be stuck in a city because there were dark corners on roads I had to access. It was perfectly acceptable to have dark corners in a park that I might want to visit. Okay. And if I chose to go to dark corners, that's fine. That was my choice. But I should not be forced to go to dark corners while going to a bus stop, while going to a railway station. All the infrastructural facilities that I had to access needed to be well lit. There also needed to be a provision of public toilets. But one of the things we found was that public toilets, and this you will have seen in whichever cities or towns you're in, often have three sections. One is a women's toilet section, one is a men's toilet section, and then the third section is a men's urinal section. Okay, the men's urinal section tends to be free and it's often open. Okay, it's not locked, whereas the two toilet sections close at night. Now, of course, it is a different matter that the few men that we interviewed, and we interviewed far fewer men than we did women. In fact, we interviewed a very small number of men. but they said they also do not use public urinals at night because they feel unsafe. Okay, and quite often they would say that there are drug users in the urinals or whatever. But anyway, these urinals exist and they are open. So the message is that men might be in public space at night and they may desire to use it. But the toilets close at various different times. Some of them close at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. 11, at least at the time that we were doing our research, was the latest that toilets closed. Okay, so the toilets that stayed open the longest stayed open till about 11 o'clock. So the message that sends basically is that, oh, we don't expect women to be in public space after 11 o'clock at night. And that, I would argue, is deeply problematic. Okay, because even if two women are using that infrastructure must be available and it must be clean, well lit, accessible at all times. Okay, now this is I mean, and there's a group in Mumbai called the Right to Pee campaign, and they've been lobbying, and they've been engaged in all kinds of advocacy for better public toilets. So we were very clear to say that the city administration must provide for infrastructure and nobody should be forced to take risks not of their choosing. However, the risk that we do choose, okay, the risk of enjoying the streets, the risk of going into dark corners, the risk of hanging out. And we argued that part of the excitement of the city was precisely this, right? The edginess, the thrill, the uncertainty that it offered. And I want to also flag here somewhat tangentially was that, and this was quite a few years, this was a few years after we finished our research. We finished our research in 2006. In 2008, two of us, myself and Shilpa Phadke, spent 6 weeks in Singapore looking at questions of loitering in the city. We had a residency which was part of the International Symposium of Electronic Arts. And in many ways, Singapore was an extremely safe city. Okay, it was also a very accessible city. It had great public transport. But we found, and it also had very, very low levels of sexual harassment, extremely low levels of sexual harassment. However, it seemed to us, and I sort of talk about this at length in an essay I wrote called, I think it was called Unfriendly Bodies, Hostile Cities, which was published in the EPW in 2013. It seemed to us that the whole of Singapore was safe in the way in which a mall is safe. Okay, that it was almost as if the whole of the city resembled a privatized. And in fact, two expatriate women told us that unlike the cities where they came from, Singapore might have been relatively free of sexual harassment, but they said it was also free of sexual possibility. That it was rare that you would meet someone randomly. Okay, and they articulated this as a loss, right? So while the city is a space of potential threat, it's also always a space of potential possibility, right? And it seemed to us that Singapore, somehow that possibility had been denuded from Singapore, that it had been turned into a kind of homogenized, sanitized space. And clearly, some of the women, at least whom we were interviewing, were articulating this as a loss. Of course, I mean, they were also saying that Singapore was also a very racially homosocial space, that people tend to socialize also in very racially segregated ways. All right. Another thing that I wanted, so this is what we were arguing in relation to this, basically, okay? That nobody should be forced to take risks not of their choosing. Now, there are two things here. One is that, of course, we have to strive for ideological change, okay? That there are families who want to, as I said, restrict the mobility of their daughters, decide whom they will marry, prefer that they don't meet any strange men at all, okay? There is also, okay, the fact that women themselves internalize these ideas and they will often choose to safeguard their reputations over their physical safety. So one of the things that young women, particularly those who lived in buildings which had one community living in them. So whether it was an entirely Gujarati Jain building, or entirely Saraswat building, or a Bhori Muslim building, or it didn't matter which community the building was. Okay, any building that belonged to one community, the women felt watched all the time, and it was relevant because particularly if you were a young unmarried woman, the others in your building often knew the universe of people into whose families you could marry, right? So your reputations became even more important than they would be if you were living in a heterogeneous building where people knew each other, but they don't know the extended world into which you might have an arranged marriage, right? In fact, one woman, this was in relation to Gujarati, I think, Jain building on Balbar Hill, said that when her men friends dropped her home at night, she asked them to drop her 100 meters away from where she actually lived, so that she would not be seen getting out of the car driven by some guy. Okay, so she would then walk this street. She would rather walk, possibly putting herself at some physical risk, than be seen. So we said, oh, but who will see you? They said, oh, the security will see us. The security will then talk to the domestic workers, and the domestic workers will talk to their employers, right? And so then this rumor will start about this girl who goes out with men late at night, right? So one question, of course, is that we must address this question. We must address this. And one of the things that is though perhaps not relevant to a question of public policy, is something that I feel very, very strongly about, is that quite often when police catch couples, okay, on promenades and wherever, okay, and in various cities across the country, the police will go suddenly on an obscenity drive. It's not throughout the year, but suddenly they will decide that couples holding hands are obscene, okay, and then for a period of 1 or 2 months or whatever, they will find them. And one of the things they do when they meet such couples is they threaten to call their parents, okay. Now the tragedy of this situation is that for these young people, their parents are often scarier than that policeman. And I feel very, very strongly that how much would change if those young people could say, yes, call my parents, or say, I have already called my parents are coming. How much we would buttress young people's capacity to produce safety for themselves if they knew that their parents had their back. That parents, in fact, by deciding that their daughters must not meet men, that their daughters cannot go somewhere, they actually make their daughters and their sons far more vulnerable to state functionaries like the police, to even goons, if you like, right? Because there's so much fear of the parent. So coming back to the point on ideology. So one is, of course, we have to strive to change these ideologies. And that's something that I find young people today are doing in very, very many ways. They're pushing against the boundaries. And we see one of the things I've seen in the last year and a half, particularly in the protests against the Citizenship Act of 2019, is that young people were pushing back against their families, who kept saying, and particularly in universities, and their families would say, don't go to the protests. And young people were rebelling and defying their families in order to really serve a higher cause, right? The cause of democracy. So clearly, young people are not necessarily towing this line. And I think that those ideologies are being challenged. But tied to this is the question of infrastructure. So should we wait until there are large numbers of women in public space to provide those public toilets? Or should we push to have those public toilets provided now? Okay. If you all remember, about a year ago, the Delhi government said that they were going to make public transport free for women. Okay. And there was a huge hue and cry over this. Okay. The huge hue and cry was over like, why? And it's not only, and I remember some years ago in Berlin, also on Women's Day, they reduced the fare for women on public transport by 21%, which is the gender wage gap. I think it's 21. I'm not 100% sure of that figure, but they reduced the fare for women by the amount, which is the percent that is the gender wage gap. Okay, and men were incensed. German men were incensed that women for one day were being charged less on public transport, or for 1 month. I forget whether it was 1 day or 1 month, but for a short period were being charged. So here also there was this kind of, is the sun on my face? Or I'm seeing it? One sec, let me just put it.
Yeah, it's better now.
So people were very, very upset. They are like, oh, middle class women are going to take advantage of this, and why shouldn't they pay? And but it seemed to me as if there was something else happening there. Okay, if a woman can potentially walk out of her house without a single naya paisa in her pocket, okay, and get into a bus or get into a train, get onto the metro and go somewhere, okay, this raises her mobility in a way that's highly discomforting to her family. Her family does not want this, right? So changes in public policy have the capacity, okay, to provide mobility. These changes matter. Even and they need to come. We need to push for them to come, whether or not ideology has changed as much as we would like it to. Whether or not we have challenged patriarchy enough, whether or not patriarchal structures, we need to push to change facilities, to change infrastructure, to change questions of access. We often found that young women would say, oh, this reservation for women on trains. And they particularly did not like the reservation of seats on buses for women. It's like, why do we need seats on buses? This is discrimination. This is, this kind of thing. But it seemed to us that what this does is it puts out the message that here is a train, okay? And in Bombay, the trains run till about 1:30 a.m. in the morning, in the early morning, and they start at 4:30 a.m. So they're literally running for 21 hours of the day, right? And you have this women's compartment, and there was a fight in the 1980s that some part of it is a women's compartment for all the 24 hours. Okay, some of them change. Some of these compartments are women's compartments only during the rush hour, but there are compartments that are women's compartments for 24 hours. And now you have seats on buses. It sends the message that here it's only 15% of the train, but it exists. So we're running a train. It leaves Churchgate or VT station at 12:37 a.m. and we have a women's compartment. So it sends the message that women belong on this train. Women belong in public at 12:37 a.m. in the morning. And it's a really powerful message. The other thing that is important here is that at rush hour, we need to distinguish between what one might call, and perhaps you'll have already done this, what one would call formal equality and substantive equality. Formal equality is, here's a train, everybody can get onto the train. Substantive equality would mean, here's a train, everybody actually does get onto the train, right? So which is why a women's compartment, given the current situation where there is sexual harassment, where people do take advantage of crowded spaces, women often might end up not getting onto trains in the rush hour if there was no reservation of compartments, right? So we've argued, and we often have this discussion with young women in workshops, that in fact, until such time that we don't have sexual harassment, we do in fact need these compartments. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to talk about are these other men. Okay. So, like I said, the debate, the discourse of safety is often premised on these two axes: one, respectable women and poor migrant men or poor men as perpetrators, and respectable women and non-respectable women. I want to focus on these migrant men, these poor men, whoever they might be, right? What this discourse does is it renders women forever potential victims in public space, and these poor men forever potential perpetrators in public space. And in doing so, it renders both of them outsiders to public space. So these men might hang out in public space. Okay, you might see them in public space. You may say, oh, they are the lukhas, the lafangas, the taporis, whoever it is. You may see them in public space, but they too are looked upon with great suspicion. Okay, so they also do not belong to public space. In fact, middle class, upper caste, Hindu, able-bodied women might in fact have greater legitimacy in public space than do poor migrant men, for instance, right? Now, what this does in the city, and it's not only poor migrant men, right? We have a whole list of people who might be cast as unbelongers in the city, people who don't belong. Increasingly, we know in the country that we live in, and this is not new, but it has become more visible. People are more articulate about it. We live in cities that are very, very anti-Muslim, right? We live in cities that are increasingly anti-poor, okay? Post globalization, and of course the change was slow, but I'm just using globalization because that's a clear marker at which things change. Pre globalization, housing, education were all responsibilities of the state, and if people were homeless, there was a responsibility that the state held, okay? And in the 80s, certainly in Bombay, you often saw middle class people sitting in protest over slum demolition. There's a fisher colony in Cuff Parade in Bombay, okay, where where the city administration wanted to shift them, demolish this fisher colony, and there was a huge protest at which not just middle class people but Hindi film stars, okay, sat there in protest against this demolition. Now you would not see this today. You would not, middle class people now are much more likely to run your local ALMs, okay, which say clean up my 200 meters of the city. Don't have hawkers, don't have dustbins, I don't want this, I don't want that, right? These are what our local area management groups do, right? They work with our local municipal corporations, and their vision is to clean up the city in accordance with some kind of vision of global aspirational cities. So there's a whole group of people who are outsiders. Now, if you're poor and if you don't have housing, it's your fault, okay, in a way that it certainly was not in the 70s and the 80s. And so that discourse has shifted. And you have this entire group of people. And when we look at our work and our writing on the city, we realize that far more than 2008 and 9 when we wrote the book, and even more than and also 2011 when our book was published. Today, we live in far more fractured cities, okay? Cities that are cut along class lines and where visions of neoliberalism, right, of what the city should be, that we want to move people into mass rapid transport. We don't want people on our streets. We don't want people on the streets are messy. We don't want messy streets. And what we began to argue in line with this, so from the argument around risk, okay, we move to an argument around loitering. Okay, Bombay and many other cities have a legislation that says, and this is under the Bombay Police Act of 1955, that anyone seen to be loitering suspiciously between sunset and sunrise can be arrested without an arrest warrant. Basically, and one of the things we always planned to do, but we never did, was to go and check who are these people who get arrested. And they are brought before a magistrate in the morning. And we always planned to go to that magistrate's court, but we never did. But so loitering was seen as something that was debased, that was, and when we started to talk about loitering, and our argument was that you cannot claim the city for women unless you claim it also for other marginal citizens, including those who are seen to be unfriendly to women. So including the men who hang out at street corners, including the sex workers, including the bar dancers, all those who might be seen either to threaten women's physical safety or, like the bar dancers and the sex workers, to threaten women's reputations, right? So we argued that the only way in which women would have unconditional access to public space was if everybody else also had unconditional access to public space. And of course, the young women in our workshops, and we did a lot of workshops during our research, okay, loved the idea of loitering because all of them were battling their families at that point. They were young women and all of them faced restrictions on their mobility. They realized that despite the fact that they came from families where resources were plentiful, many of them middle-class women, they did not have the same access to public space as their men friends or their male peers, right? And so they love, And these were women who would often preface any gender-friendly statement they made with the disclaimer, I am not a feminist, but. Okay. So here were these women saying, I am not a feminist, but they loved the idea of loitering. Feminist scholars, feminist activists, feminist advocates to whom we presented our work found it extremely frivolous. They said, but why would you want to loiter? Even good men don't loiter. Okay. So loitering was seen or would be seen very, very low down on what Nivedita Menon has called the hierarchy of oppressions, right? I mean, people don't get food, people don't have access to healthcare or education, and you want to loiter. Like, I mean, what is this? What are you even talking about, right? So there was a lot of pushback from a feminist discourse against this idea that loitering might produce access to public space. The other question, okay, which often made us very nervous, like the question, what will your research do, was the question, how will you operationalize loitering? And of course, we didn't actually have an answer, right? Because this was for us a conceptual utopian idea. We're saying that, look, here is the reality that women can't unconditionally access public space. The only way, conceptually, in an abstract utopian world, they might be able to is if we said everyone else can. And one of the texts that we used a number of texts to argue this. Okay, one of these was a work by which you all may have read, Michel de Certeau's the practices of everyday life. So I don't know if you all have read it, but in that is an essay called Walking the City, which again is easily accessible. You just key it in and it turns up on any search engine. Where he argues that planners love to view the city from the top. They love maps. They want to go to some high point. They want to use drones. Okay. And he, in fact, starts his essay at the top of the World Trade Center in New York. He says that planners want to go up there and they want to grasp the entire city. And his argument is that the people who are really writing the city, the people who are making the narrative of the city, are those who are walking on the street. Okay. Who are with their bodies, okay, reworking and reimagining the space of that city. The second text that we used was a work called, an essay called City Life and Difference by a fabulous philosopher called Iris Marion Young. Okay, Iris Marion Young writes on a variety of themes, and there's one more that might be of interest to you, though not directly relevant to public policy, is an essay called Throwing Like a Girl. Okay, Throwing Like a Girl is another essay which is easily accessible online, where she talks about the fact, and she uses the work of Ponti to make the case that all of us inhabit bodies that instinctively have a sense that they can do, that they can access. But she says that women are trained, or women learn, and what she calls an inhibited intentionality. So their I can becomes an I cannot. They're careful. They think they're going to fall. Because this is what they are trained. They're trained, oh, you'll fall. Oh, you'll hurt yourself. Oh, so she says women then become very, very hesitant users of the space around them, right? So that's Throwing Like a Girl. Sorry, I digress. The essay that I wanted to talk about was City Life and Difference, where Iris Marion Young argues, she says a lot of our nostalgic visions of the city, okay, are about communitarian life. We're always harking back to some vision of community. But she says communities by their nature are exclusive. They do not include. It's always about who belongs, who doesn't belong. She says what we need to strive for really is a politics of difference. That is not that we should all know each other, but we should recognize and respect everyone's right to belong in that space. Okay, a respect for difference. And the fact that everybody can be in that space. So she said, what we really need is to look at questions of difference. So we use this scholarship to argue that loitering might then, okay, offer us a vision of a respect for diversity, of a diverse public space, which, while it might have people who you might find unfriendly, will also have people whom you find friendly, right? Tied to this neoliberal vision of the city is also the question of hawkers, okay? systematically various cities across India have been trying to get rid of hawkers or to zone hawkers into some tiny space, right? Where otherwise hawkers would be across the city. And in our interviews, okay, almost without exception, women said that hawkers on the street make them feel safer. Because if there are hawkers, there are people buying stuff from the hawkers, whether it's food or books or whatever. And hawkers often come with their own lighting, right? They'll have those Petromax lamps. Sometimes they have even electric lighting. So they also add lighting to the street. Okay. And in fact, hawkers who have been on a street for long, in fact, in many middle class housing societies, the women would often say that their vegetable vendors had been on that street for 25 years, whereas the security guard in their building changed every 2 months, right? So they felt far greater security from the vegetable vendor who would stand outside the building than they did from their local security guard, right? But however, the anxiety is that hawkers space and our cities are no longer adequately global, right? So these are the anxieties that then reduce hawkers' access to the public. Okay, I will talk for another 5 minutes and then we can open up. The question of public space as public, right? Increasingly, we are told that our recreation must be private. Go to a mall, go to a coffee shop, all these spaces are fine. Don't walk on the promenade, don't hang out in public because this messes up the streets, right? And one of the things we've noticed, even since we did our research, public parks were already fenced in and they were already being closed at night. Now, I don't know about other cities, but we've noticed in Bombay that between 2003 and 6, when we were doing our research, public parks would open in the morning and they would close at night, about 7, 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Now they also close for several hours in the afternoon. So they open in the morning and then they close in the afternoon and then they open again in the evening. And the anxiety really is, quote unquote, when you ask people, and we did some interviews even at that time, the anxiety is vandalism, or the anxiety is that people will come there and sleep. So what if people come there and sleep? Okay. The anxiety is that couples will come there and make out. And this is as a complete aside. Okay. So we were in this, we did a lot of ethnographic work in parks, and we found, and this was in the afternoon, so there were couples in the park in the afternoon. These poor couples have nowhere else to go. I feel like parks should be open so they can be there. So there were couples in these parks. They were not doing much. Okay. They would sit there and they would hold hands or they would stick to each other. Now there were these couples. Then there was a category of people. There were young boys who must have been about 15 or 16. Okay. Who would go around watching these couples. Okay. So here were the couples, and then there were these boys who would go around watching these couples. So they were the boyers. And then there was us. We would watch the boys watching the couple. So God knows, we were some triple layer of voyeurism, if you like. Okay. But there's this huge anxiety about what is happening in these parks. And these poor couples who are holding hands, who are going to offend our elderly and corrupt our young. I mean, really, we have so little romance and love and joy in the world. I think, if young people saw couples holding hands, it's a thing of joy, right? Not something that will corrupt them or it should not offend old people. But anyway, we are very, very worried about the sensibilities of our elders and the virtue of our children, right? All right. So public space increasingly is highly policed, okay? And here's where public policy comes in. We do need to challenge this public policy. Recently in the Bombay development plan, the Mumbai development plan, there was a gender component, but it tended to stick to things like women's hostels. And I feel like we need to push them further to also argue for more facilities in the public. The last thing I want to talk about is the question of citizenship. And one of the things one has seen is that in the last 2 decades, women, particularly young women, have made a lot of strides forward in claiming public space. And so one of the things that happened was that a group of women and one theater activist and actor and director by the name of Neha Singh read our book in 2014. And she actually started a loitering movement. It's called the Loiter Movement. And she and a group of people used to loiter. And even now, actually, in the middle of the pandemic, they do it sometimes. They would loiter every weekend. So now when people ask us, how are you going to operationalize this? We don't have to answer it because Neha Singh and a whole lot of other movements, whether of young women's movements to access public space have responded to this question, that yeah, people do want to access the public and they are accessing it as a challenge to patriarchal ideologies. And one of the things that Neha and others would often say is that if they're walking out late in the night, some rickshaw guy will stop for them and say, "Madam, I will drop you home. Don't walk alone." And they would like, "Why you want to drop us home? We actually want to walk on the street." So they have these conversations with you. Or some police guy will say, "Why are you out here? Why don't you get?" And they would have these conversations. The sure argument really is that two things happen. One is that you have these conversations with people. And she says that by inhabiting that public space with your body, there's also a micro transformation in yourself, in how you see your body and how you see the public in relation to it. Now, the other thing that has changed is that loitering has entered a feminist lexicon of access to public space. And this gives us great joy that there will now be people who have not read our work who will talk about loitering, okay? Who don't know that it comes from our work. And for us, this is a source of great excitement and joy that the word loitering is very much part of any feminist question of access to public space. However, the mainstream discourse is ever more fixated on safety, okay? And part of the reason it's ever more fixated on safety is that these young women are making them very anxious. These young women are now claiming public space, and they are claiming, if you look at the anti-CAA protests, they were run largely peaceful protests run by women, old women, young women, Muslim women, and large numbers of women in universities. And you see the numbers of young women, university students whom they have jailed, right? They are deeply anxious. And here were women. So you have women claiming public space on their own behalf as a collective, as an act of being citizens. And then you have young women defending citizenship and defending democracy on behalf of an entire nation, right? And these two events, I think, are not unconnected. And in response to this is a huge pushback. You have in Uttar Pradesh, you have the ordinance that seeks to control who can convert for purposes of marriage. And they call it has been called colloquially the love jihad ordinance, even though there is not a single case of love jihad, right? We don't want our daughters to decide whom they will marry. We certainly don't want them to marry across religious lines. In the state of Madhya Pradesh, the chief minister was quoted saying that they want women, they want women to report to police stations before they go out, so that police stations will track them. This is an act of surveillance, right? Surveillance it's against every feminist principle of access to the public. And recently, and I'm sure you've seen this, you have the Chief Minister of Uttarakhand very, very anxious about a mother who sat next to him wearing ripped jeans, right? So now the values of our children cannot even withstand ripped jeans. I mean, I have to say, as someone who grew up in the 80s and as a deeply middle class person, I also am very uncomfortable with ripped jeans because, like, why would people sort of, and so it's interesting to find myself in the position of now defending ripped jeans. But of course, it's not about ripped jeans, right? It's about our right to make choices, to decide what we wear, whom we are out with, what we might study, whom we may marry, whether we want to marry or not, whether we prefer women. All of these are choices that we should be able to make. But there is a huge policy pushback. And I'm really, really delighted to be speaking to a group of people who I hope will be policy makers in the future. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for that absolutely beautiful talk. We'll now take questions. I think Dipali has a question. So Dipali, if you could just unmute yourself and speak up.
Yes, sorry, I have to leave for a workout, so wanted to ask a question quickly. So it's I had this amazing half 1 hour conversation hearing you out. It was just so candid. But also I live in Delhi, and there is this general notion that people have with the ladies coach, the ladies dabba that you were talking about. When we or as a group of girls enter a normal coach, people tend to think that they have a reserved dabba for themselves. Why don't they go into that dabba? And if they're not going there, then they're sort of seeking attention of people, and they're wearing short clothes and this and that. And they don't really respect your, it's just our choice that we want to go in the normal coach rather than going into the women's coach. So I was just thinking around the lines that having a separate dabba gives a different sort of signaling. What would you think about that?
Really good question. And in Bombay, which is I think slightly more, I mean, I don't know what the word is, but we would also be often confronted with this idea that every other coach then is a men's coach. Okay. And though one might not be harassed, or there wasn't a sense perhaps that you wanted attention, there was a sense that you are occupying space that rightfully belonged to them. So they would give you very dirty looks, especially if you sat. If you sat, so they hated it. Like, you are, how dare you occupy real estate that belongs to us? So I think that one of the things we need to do is also make this education, and this was true even in buses, that those dabbas are not men's dabbas, they are general dabbas. And we would often, if somebody said something to us, we would say, yeah, aapka compartment nahi hai, ye general compartment hai, aur hum general janta hai.
General, right.
We are also part of this general public. And should we desire to be, which is again this idea, right? That if we choose to be in that space also belongs to us. But you're right, it's an uphill task. I mean, to convince people who have a sense of entitlement to that space. And this idea that if you have this tiny little space, then all of you must only occupy that tiny little space. I think that there needs to be far more education around, and in Bombay they were often referred to as men's compartments. So we actually went around doing this campaign saying it's not a men's compartment, it's a general compartment. But yeah, it's a really good question, and one for which I don't have a direct sort of solution at least. But I think that we do need to do far more education on these lines.
Thank you.
Keshava, you had a question.
Yeah, hi, Keshav here. Thank you so much for the talk. It was extremely enlightening. I think this is one of the few talks that I've actually enjoyed for a while. So I had two questions. One is so it's from experience that I wanted to share. So I've lived in Chennai and I've lived in Bangalore. The buses that the people use are literally the same. Both of them are provided by the same company, the same size. The only difference is the way the women reserved seats are actually divided. Now in Chennai, it's divided in a vertical line. So the seats on the left are for women and the seats on the right are for men. In Bangalore, the front 4 or 5 seats are actually reserved for women, and then everything else is reserved for men. Ideally speaking, shouldn't we be going with a model where both of them are on, where the line is divided vertically? Because there is a path which is actually shared by both men and women, and they will actually be forced to interact, but in a way that would generate positive outcomes. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Or is this division meaningless in the first place? My second question is, we're talking about Mumbai. Mumbai is a very organic city. I don't think any other city in this country is more organic than Mumbai, maybe Delhi. Not even Bangalore, not even Chennai, not even Kolkata. But my question is, since I'm from Bangalore, the area that I'm living in has developed in the last 10 years, which means it was entirely developed as a middle-class society, an area which is meant for only these people, and these people created the rules. So in that sense, if I'm a policymaker and I have to come here and make a law, would it be difficult for me to convince all of these people because the thought or the right to do certain things did not organically generate? Or do you think all processes will have to go through this stage by stage basis, where over a period of time the society changes and the way people interact within the society also changes? So those are my two questions.
Okay. Starting with your first one on the buses. So you're saying in Chennai, they literally half belongs to women and half belongs to men. And they can't cross.
The central portion, half belongs to women, half belongs to men. Central pathway, both of them have to use the same passageway to get out.
Right. But there are seats that are seen as men's seats. They are not general seats.
Oh, sorry, yeah, general seats. On the right hand side, there's general seats. I'm so sorry. I feel
women can also sit there.
Yes. Women, women can also sit there. Yeah, my bias is already coming out right now. So yeah.
Okay. So there's this kind of segregation which often does what you're saying, because it then becomes like all the rest. Whereas at least in Chennai, it appears that half the seats are for women, which is not bad. Okay, that the assumption is that there will be 50% women in that bus, which is actually quite a decent assumption as opposed to many others. Now in Bombay, you have the front six, there are only 6 seats which are reserved for women, and then you have seats for old people and you have seats for the disabled. But the remainder of the bus is clearly understood to be general. And part of the reason was that these seats became reserved only sometime in the 1990s. Before this, there were no reserved seats for women, at least. They had only reserved seats, I think, for older, even I think disabled people, there were reserved seats. But otherwise, all of the rest is new. New in the sense, well, now it's 30 years old, but relatively speaking. I have 2 thoughts on this. One is that there's often this vision of segregation that involves the suggestion that men and women should not interact at all. Okay, and that's the best case scenario. And part of this is also because they should not fall in love with the unsuitable type of people. Okay, so it's like if you don't interact at all. And part of this is also seen in, and I think this is particularly true of engineering colleges, where you will have different staircases for women and different staircases for men. Men and women will occupy different parts of the classroom. Okay, and so all of it is aimed at ensuring that men and women remain strangers to each other, which I find deeply problematic, right? That we never learn as young people, as school students, to see each other as human beings, and to see. And I remember, and this is sort of just as a well, it's not that tangential actually. I'm not sure this is still the case, but a couple of years ago, I remember reading a news item which said that at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, they had a late night bus. So it's a large campus and there's a late night bus, okay, that moves around the campus that can be used to get from point A to point B, particularly if you don't have your own cycle or two-wheeler or whatever to get. But the proviso was that only women could use this bus. Men students were not allowed to use this bus. Now, what this does to my mind, okay, is to say that men are inevitably then potential perpetrators of violence. And if they occupy this bus with women, whom we must protect and keep safe, so then to keep them safe, we are giving you a bus. But then we can't allow the men on this bus because they might attack you. So what you do then is you assume that there can be no human relationship between men and women, that we can never be friends, that we can never have connections with each other. The only possible connection you can have is a family arranged marital one, okay, with any man who is not your brother or your uncle or your father or something. So the bus question, in a sense, and because this was a bus that men were not allowed to use, so I would argue that yes, you do need seats because A, it sends the message of citizenship and it allows a certain kind of space. But we do need to separate it from the desire to segregate women and men into 2 spaces where they never interact with each other. Yeah, I'm not sure if this directly answers your question, but I feel like we do need to see them as 2 different things. One, the desire to claim the public and to recognize that women are citizens, and 2, to argue against the impulse to ensure that men and women never interact as fellow citizens, as fellow students, as possible friends, as possible romantic interests. You know, it's the kind of thing we were talking that I sort of write about in relation to, say, Singapore. That part of the excitement of being in the public is sometimes just you're in a bus or you're in a train and you see somebody and there's a kind of frisson of attraction. Okay, it's just that moment. You may never see that person again, but it's there and it's exciting and it's part of the pleasure of being in the public, right? So we should not desire sanitized spaces in our quest for safety. The quest must be citizenship. The second one, I think that middle classes, whether they are in organically grown cities and they start to claim space, or they create a new space across not just India, but elsewhere, increasingly the middle classes want to be in gated communities. They want to exclude the poor. They want to give passes. And I think that this is true of Bangalore also, that there are increasingly gated communities that have private security. So they are controlled by private security. And I think that really we do need to challenge this vision of the middle class, of themselves only as tax-paying citizens who deserve access to the city. Okay. And the pandemic has made this very, very clear. Who are the essential workers? Not us teachers, not the corporates, not any of this, right? The essential workers are your garbage collectors, your milkmen, your newspaper walas to some extent, though perhaps not so much. These are our essential workers, right? These are the people without whom the city does not run. The middle classes are really very superfluous. And we do need to. So, to respond to your question, yes, I think that when they create a society, they create this space, perhaps they feel even more entitled. But I think even those who are in these organic cities, the minute they start to occupy real estate, they become very, very entitled and very, this sense of we are, quote unquote, and you all must have all heard this term, we are the tax-paying citizens. So we are the only ones entitled to the city. And it's really not true, because you may be paying tax, but there's a whole group of people who actually make the city habitable, and it's not us.
I think Tushar has posted a question in the chat. Tushar, would you like to speak up, or should I read it out?
Yeah, I'd like to speak up.
Yeah.
So, Professor, very interesting presentation. Just wanted to understand what would be the implications of, say, for example, vehicle ownership for women, those of them especially who are aspirational, and those of them who feel like they can transition from, say, maybe public transport to using their own vehicle. And would that mean that they have better access to public spaces, or there is more reach in terms of where they can actually travel? So just curious to know your thoughts.
Okay, that's a great question. So two things in this relation. I think that in our interviews, middle and upper middle class women certainly articulated that if they had private vehicles, they articulated a greater access to public space, that they felt mobile, though many of them would report, okay, and this is interesting, not one, but multiple women reported that they had been told by their families that if they were driving late at night, they were not to stop for anybody, including the police. They say if the police calls you over, don't stop. Let them take your number. We will deal with them afterwards. Do not stop for anybody. Okay, so this was the one message of safety that was sent out to them. However, okay, private vehicles, I would argue, are not the solution. So, of course, I mean, and individual women did feel, and there was this one woman who said something which I think is quite interesting. She said that she used to drive a small car, okay, a hatchback, and she said quite often, and this was she said quite often people would then push her off the road and all. So she said at some point she upgraded to an SUV, and she says now nobody messes with me. Okay, so there's this kind of, you know, I occupy space, I have a big SUV, and there's a kind of power space in that. But we also noticed that increasingly, and in Bombay now, they are busy building the coastal road, okay? Despite environmental impact studies that say this is going to be disastrous, okay? Already Bombay gets flooded every season, that this coastal road is going to only exacerbate the situation. Already we know that within the next 30 or 40 years, a large part of the city is going to get flooded, perhaps all of the time, or certainly a significant portion of the time, but they are still building the coastal road. So I feel like while on the one hand, individual women might get an increased access to public space via private transport, eventually we have to lobby for public transport, because that's the only way in which we claim public space, but we claim it for a much larger group of women. No, not just women, but all marginalized. Over the last, and you will find a lot of articles in relation to this, over the last 1 decade, the BEST, which is the Bombay Electric and Transport Company in Mumbai, which actually ran for many years the most amazingly well-run public transport system, okay, has been disinvesting. They've been reducing routes, they've been reducing buses, and they've been hiking up fares. As they hike up fares, the poor people take shared rickshaws, which are now increasingly cheaper. The shortest ride, okay, is now cheaper to share a rickshaw than to take the bus. Okay, so the poor then start taking. Then the BEST will say, "Oh, people are not using the bus." Then they disinvest further, right? So they use this in this very standard neoliberal tactic to disinvest. And what we really need to do, and there is a huge movement to reinvest in the BEST buses and not to privatize them. One of the other things that we've been saying is that the gang rape and murder that took place in December 2012 in Delhi took place on a private blue line bus. Now, I will stick my neck out and say this cannot happen on a BEST bus for the simple reason that you cannot take a BEST bus for a joyride. Okay, the BEST is a public service sector undertaking. It runs with certain kinds of regulations. Only you can only take the bus out when it is mandated, right? You cannot, 5 people can't get onto the bus and say, let's go for a ride on it, and then we'll harass people or then sexually assault them, right? And so really we do need to push for a public system that is publicly funded and that is not intended to make money. When we say it is a public service, the intention is you take taxpayers' money and you fund it. It is not supposed to make a profit. And we need to really, really push for this. So I would, so that's my answer. So I think that yes, some women individually do find joy and pleasure in individual transport, but it cannot be our answer as citizens who are seeking claim to public space for everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
We'll just take one last question. Nikhil, can you?
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us. My question is a little bit related to Deepali's question about men giving cold looks when you enter the general coach. I'm curious, how does one go about dealing with the effects of these gender responsive policies like reservations on men and how it can offset the outcome of the policy itself or even create unintended consequences? In other words, I'm thinking, how do we ensure behavior change also happens hand in hand?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like I said, the reactions to free public transport by the Delhi government or even in Berlin where women were being charged less, the kind of rage that men expressed seemed off the charts, and I don't know, actually, it's a great question. One of the ways, of course, is that you have lots of groups that are working with men. You have in Mumbai, in Maharashtra, you have a group called Men Against Violence. It's called MAVA. I don't know whether we can engage in schools better. I don't know if anyone else has an answer. I really don't. It's a great question that how do we remind men that, and I think that it's a bigger question than that as well, that when you make space for women and that equity, that when men are privileged in relation to public transport or when they are privileged in relation to the public, equality for them can look like discrimination, right? That when you're pushing for equality, and this is like, it's also the question of reservation of seats for SC, ST, OBC in education. The kind of rage you see from the upper castes, parallels this. So I think it's not just men. We need to understand that equality is not discrimination. So we need to speak to men. We need to speak to upper caste too. But yeah, I don't have an actual practical solution. I can see the problem and what you articulated it in relation to men, and I would push you to see the question of reservation in an even larger category, to sort of look at cisgender questions. To look at questions of cisgender, to look at questions of ableism, to look at casteism, all of them, where any move towards equality makes those who are privileged deeply uncomfortable. And then so you will often hear upper caste people talking about how they are disadvantaged in access to education, right? Even though historically they are extremely privileged and their privilege sort of provides them access to that education. So also men feel very, very uncomfortable when it seems as if many more women are going to be, but I don't have, I know a lot of these people are in education, so I don't even know if education provides us with any solution. It's a really great question, but one for which I don't have really a practical answer. I think we all need to think about possibilities, and for y'all as potential policy makers to think about how we can incorporate a kind of peer education into the policy making process. That how do we build into the policy a simultaneous education system saying that, look, this is about equitable citizenship. I don't know if it will convince people, but perhaps we could try. I'm sorry, I don't think I answered that in any substantive way.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, it's quite confusing, and I have some anecdotal evidence also from some of my field work. And you see, women have reservation in Panchayati Raj also. And while there's some evidence that it kind of creates an additional bargaining power for women, but I'm not sure if anyone's looking at the behavioral change. Maybe I have to look at evidence on that. But yeah, but there's also this pattern of all these gender policies looking at reservations, reservation of seats, or concession on some price, or reservation in leadership positions, or cash transfers directly to women. I'm curious also if you know of any policies that are looking at behavioral change specifically. This will be the last question. Sorry, PD.
No, I don't. I don't actually know any that specifically target behavioral change, but I can check and maybe y'all can also look. But I do want to add that I think that representation matters. That having people, so having people representing minorities, people representing different groups of people, including women, in various spaces, whether it is in policy making or in the Panchayati Raj or in parliament, wherever, even when these people do not actively intervene to change things for their communities. And I say this as somebody who grew up in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister. And this was her second stint after the emergency, okay? And there was a lot of critique of her in my family, and there was a kind of cordial dislike of her. But she was there. She was on the television every day. She never really did anything that was particularly geared towards gender equity or towards women. But the fact that she was on television all the time and people kept saying the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and she was very articulate and seemed very powerful, made a very big difference to someone like me who was 7 or 8 or 9 years old when this was happening, in terms of how I imagined what I could be. That when you see people who are like you, so in my case, a woman, as the most powerful, potentially the most powerful person in the country at that moment, it transforms your capacity to imagine what you can be. So really, I feel that representation, even when those people don't do anything other than just occupy those chairs, matters. So I just wanted to flag that.
Okay, with that, we'll close the session. Thank you so much, Shilpa, for making it. And it was a beautiful and illuminating session. And for me personally, I really enjoyed it as well. So can we just take a quick photo, if that's okay with you?
Yeah. And thanks so much for the great question. And particularly for those of you who kept your videos on. It's always really helpful to see people's expressions and, to know that people are engaging.